renowned community leader and executive director of CARE Michigan. And we are here to do a post election analysis and breakdown of the Muslim impact on this election and what we can expect going forward. Imam Dawood, Jazakallah khair. Thank you for coming.
Wa alaikum assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.
So let's get right into it. What do you think the impact of the Muslim vote and the Muslim, not just the Muslim vote necessarily, but the Muslim factor in this election was?
Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim, alhamdulillah, wa sallallahu ala nabiyyina Muhammadin wa ala alihi wa sahbihi wasallam. Well, I think that nationwide, this vote was this election was very important for the American Muslim community as all of America, and especially in swing states like Michigan. If we look at CARE's exit poll data, both nationally and the state of Michigan, it was the first time that American Muslims broke outside of the political duopoly of picking either Democrat or Republican and actually voted third party as a sign of independence that Muslims have a voice and that we actually can we can actually place some sort of effect on the outcome of the determination of electoral politics during a presidential year. So I think it was very important and very pivotal of this year's election.
So how do you see, I would say, the shifting of polls that has taken place? I mean, it used to be that the Muslim community, especially on the aftermath of 9/11, voted very loyally Democrat for the last 20 years.
Right.
And we would see over 80% of those who voted among the Muslim community usually vote Democrat nationwide. This year, there was a massive detach from the Democratic Party that happened. A great chunk of the Muslim vote went to the third party,
Yeah.
but there was a substantial amount who actually opted to vote for the Republicans and for Donald Trump directly as well. What do you make of this? How did this happen? Why did this happen? Is it something that is going to be sustained, do you think?
So I would just remind the viewers, Brother Rex, that in 2000, the majority of American Muslims actually voted for the Republican Party. They weren't on the donkey plantation, right? And it was due to the events of 9/11 and then draconian policies of the Bush administration. Even though Democrats equally voted for, the Patriot Act and some of these very invasive policies, and also there was bipartisan voting for the invasions of Afghanistan and then Iraq, and totally illegal occupation, which led to about 1 million Iraqis being killed. This drove the Muslim community to the left in the arms of the party of the donkey. And it's really been the genocide that's taken place in Gaza under the Biden-Harris administration. And they're totally thumbing their nose at the Muslim community and the disrespect, especially when Vice President Harris came in, that really pushed a lot of the community to third party, but then also towards President Trump. And being that Vice President Harris, even when she came to Michigan, she did not meet with the grassroots of the Muslim community. She did have one meeting in Flint where she met with some people in the community who already publicly endorsed her, right? But she never came into Detroit to meet with the Muslims proper. She didn't come into Hamtramck, which is America's only Muslim majority town. She didn't come to Dearborn, which is the Arab American capital of these United States. So they took us for granted. There was some disrespectful comments, campaigning with Liz Cheney, getting endorsement of neocons, John Bolton and these people. So now, or at least not in John Bolton's case, more favorable comments towards her than to Donald Trump. And so now it also appears to be the Democratic Party is the party of neoconservatives, the party of war, the party of the military-industrial complex, more than the Republicans. And Trump, at least we can't say he's telling the truth, but many people will say, well, at least he's talking about peace. At least he's talking about putting an end to the genocide, right? So I think these are factors that drove many Muslims towards voting for Donald Trump. And then also, keep this in mind, there were some Muslims in Dearborn in particular, and I know them in Dearborn Heights, they weren't going to vote Democrat anyway because of the very liberal social agenda that does not conform with traditional Islamic values, especially when it comes to issues of gender and sexuality. That people don't want their daughters who wear hijab in a bathroom or locker room with someone who claims to be gender fluid, who's a man, and or performing in sports. Like, Muslims don't want that overall, generally, and many of the people just got fed up, especially after the Dearborn book incident with the those two books promoting the homosexual agenda. Those Muslims weren't going to vote Democrat anyway.
And this was the case in Hamtramck too. A good chunk of the Hamtramck vote was actually already planning to go to Trump before the entire genocide in Gaza started unfolding.
Yes.
I want us to focus a little bit on what opportunities have opened up. Now, there's segments within the Muslim discourse that are not necessarily happy that this kind of divorce process from the Democratic Party happened so suddenly. And there are those within our community who say that this is actually a best case scenario in terms of sustained Muslim political engagement. If you want to do politics, you want to do both sides, right? Usually. What do you think the opportunity for Muslims in the political sphere is going forward? Especially since you mentioned things like Democrats, for example, embracing neocons, Republicans solidifying under this more isolationist type of approach to foreign policy. We see the poles of the political parties shifting.
Yeah.
So what are the opportunities for Muslims here, and how can we shape national discourse?
Well, one thing I would say is that with Mr. Trump in particular, the tone was very different this year than when we had in the previous elections, where he was talking about banning Muslim countries, making a big point, talking about Muslims, using words such as radical Islam. That wasn't part of the discourse really in this election right now. Also, he refused to or not meet with Muslim leaders, and he met with Muslim leaders, not just Yemeni Americans, but West Africans, people in the Syrian community, Lebanese community. He several meetings, right? So access and as far as be able to talk about policy things does matter. One thing that the American Jewish community has done in general, and I'm being more specific about the Zionists, is that because we know that all Jews are not Zionists, and the majority of Zionists in America are Christians, to be clear.
Evangelical.
Yeah, but they talk with all sides, right? They don't put all of their eggs in one basket. So I think good for the community long term that we're able to have some outreach and some discussions with both sides of the aisle. And I think that even if Mr. Trump is insincere, it at least has given us a pathway and softened up some people's hearts on the right in the Republican Party to speak with us. And just very quickly, I'll give you an example. This past Friday, I flew to Dallas, Texas. I gave khutbah in the community there, and I was there for a weekend training. While I was in Detroit Metro Airport in the Delta terminal, I got on the train to go down to my gate, and who was on the train with me was Congressman John James, African American Republican, right? He sees me. I tell him, "Good morning, Congressman. Congratulations on your win." And then we started talking. I told him I was Care, Michigan. He immediately gave me his private cell phone number. He said, "Let's sit and set up a meeting sometime and talk." He said, "I'm willing to talk with anyone who wants to talk about peace and making our country better." So and I was wearing an all-white thobe and a kufi, by the way. Now, had this been a couple of years ago, I don't think that Congressman James would have given me his private cell phone number, right? Matter of fact, we tried to meet with his office. He wouldn't even meet with us. So even this is just a small example of like a door opening. Now, I've sent him like text messages and things like that, right? So if anything, we'll be able to at least have some conversations, at least to be able to articulate some things on behalf of our community.
Right. And I think, this is definitely a very dynamic situation. And for example, as President Trump is sorting through his cabinet and making certain choices, for example, the rejection of Mike Pompeo and Nikki Haley, some of the most neocon, war hawk, people who served in his administration from 2016 to 2020, that rejection and him making it clear that they will not be returning was very interesting, right? The appointment of someone like Mike Waltz as his national security advisor, who's a massive China hawk, but with regards to foreign intervention and foreign wars, he's not a big fan, right?
Correct.
Now, at the same time, we've also seen the appointment of people like Stephen Miller and Representative Stefanik as the UN ambassador. So the situation remains very dynamic. I mean, I think what happened with people is a lot of Muslims saw Trump as an unpredictable guy and someone who we do not know what exactly is going to come out of him, whereas we knew for a whole year what was going to come out of the Biden-Harris administration, and people made that gamble, I believe. Within our community, people made the gamble that we will deal with the uncertain over the certainty of genocide.
Correct.
And I want to speak a little bit to this idea of these walls that Hollywood propaganda, that post 9/11 propaganda had erected regarding the Muslim image in the United States. I've been in conversation with people about, for example, the imam endorsement that happened for President Donald Trump, and there's a lot of people who are not so thrilled by what happened and the kind of rhetoric that was used. And I can definitely sympathize with that point of view, and I can see where they're coming from. But one of the things I would tell them is that, look, think about it this way. For the past 20 years, a guy in a thobe and turban has been thought as the bad guy. Now imagine that bad guy standing against someone who the right wing sees as their main leader. 20 years of propaganda, and of course not in the eyes of everybody, but certainly in the eyes of quite a few people on the right, 20 years of propaganda suddenly disassembled. So this has provided us a pathway into engagement with the Republican Party, whereas previously we as a community were not even considered within the Republican Party. This was unprecedented in this election. No one expected this weird type of repositioning within the Muslim community and within the Republican Party. We had early engagements with the Trump campaign where they were very resistant to meet with imams and whatnot, but then that rhetoric changed, So there's definitely a path of opportunity here. There's definitely a path for growth for our community. But how do we ensure that that sustains? Within both sides, by the way. How do we ensure that we insert ourselves properly into the political party discourses, and that 4 years from now, the Democratic Party reflects certain values that are considering of the Muslim input, and the Republican Party does the same?
Well, I would say that a big part of this, although this is political, I think some of this has to be discussed from a spiritual angle, and that we as Muslims have to have enough love for each other that even though when we have some differences of opinion in regards to strategy, that it doesn't bring rancor in our hearts that we cancel each other, right? And the reality of it is that let there be a group of people and let them openly say we're Muslim Democrats and we're like advocating for Democrat candidates in our community. There isn't any problem as long as they're open and transparent about it, right? Likewise, if there's people engaging Republicans, right? But let us sit down together based upon our love for Allah and His Messenger, sallallahu alaihi wasallam, and love for each other. Okay, we can maybe to agree to disagree on a few issues here or there, but there's some common things as Muslims that we agree upon and that we want to see. No Muslim with a healthy spiritual heart loves seeing genocide of Muslims, apartheid in Israel. No Muslim in America in their right mind wants to see policies of anti-Muslim bigotry that would perhaps, let's say, seek the target to close down Islamic organizations, Islamic charities, right? We can agree on some of these principles right here, right? And I think that that's really where it starts, and not to deter people to say, oh, if Muslims want to talk with Republicans, they're Uncle Toms, they're sellouts, they're misguided. We're the ones that know better. We're the more enlightened ones, right? I think that we all need to check our hearts, and I referenced Dr. Sherman Abdul Hakim Jackson, Hafizullah Ta'ala, who teaches Islamic studies at USC. He taught at University of Michigan for a long time, one of our mentors when he said, "Hard work is the hard work." That's the hardest work. So we need to work on our hearts and to be able to make space that we're going to have Muslims that are going to be speaking more with Democrats, more speaking with Republicans, working on the independent track, even like speaking with people. We need to be everywhere, talking with everyone, but we have some common social political interests, and I don't think we need to be blaming people or telling people, "Oh, you voted for Trump, you're gonna meet with Trump or Republicans, you're on your own now." And then if something doesn't go right, then point the finger. "Oh, see, we told you so. You don't know what you're talking about. You're nothing." So I think we need to be very cautious about that type of unspiritual rhetoric and very, I would say, un-Islamic disposition.
Uh, yeah, I completely agree. I think having a unity of vision and a unity of purpose while taking different approaches is perfectly fine.
Yeah,
But I think that's something that our community still has to work towards.
definitely.
Which takes me to my next point.
Hmm.
What we have seen in this election cycle is arguably the largest Muslim American political mobilization in recent history in
Yes.
this country. At least in the last 20 years. I don't have much knowledge about before that, but at least in the last 20 years following September 11th, this is arguably the largest political mobilization of Muslims centered around the cause. There was a unity of vision. At the same time, we saw, as a community, people within this political apparatus who actually stood directly against the consensus and the wish of the community. So, what has transpired, in my opinion, is that the general Muslim public is seeking a dissociation from the old political establishment or old Muslim political establishment who has been leading the space so far. And there's high degree of mistrust, I believe, and people feel abused in a sort of way by this kind of establishment for not reflecting the needs of the community. What do you make of that?
Well, according to the CARE exit poll, about 80% of American Muslims actually did not vote Democrat, did not vote for Harris. Even though if we look at Michigan, for instance, we can see where, for instance, Harris got crushed in Michigan, but yet Alyssa Slotkin, who's a Democrat, she won, even though it was narrow, right? Other Congress people like Rashida Tlaib, who's in our community, overwhelmingly took her
Right.
district. Debbie Dingell, like overwhelmingly took her district, right? So it was really a referendum, more so on the president of these United States of America. So around 20% voting for Harris is still a nice amount, but it's not the majority, right? So, and when I think that those people who said Harris or bust probably need to rethink their political positions and their calculus. There is a, a yearning and a thirst in the American Muslim community, especially amongst younger people, to not be caught up in the duopoly and giving allegiance to one political party. And I think it's very interesting because I have two of my sons voted for the first time for in their first election ever voting. Right, they're both in college, and they have no memory of actually 9/11 happening. So many of us who are older, some of us maybe drifted into respectability politics and felt like we need to be under the protection of one particular party, whereas younger people, they don't have that type of phobia or fear. They are born and raised here. They don't have any real vision or real understanding of 9/11. They may understand some of the
History, yeah.
implications, but they're not traumatized to the point of having fear. Like they're not being driven by the politics of fear, like many people in my generation who were maybe in university age or just getting out of university when 9/11 happened, right? So I think that there's also a generational shift taking place, and I hope that those people who've been involved in political organizing that endorsed Vice President Harris will take heed and take more shura and actually listen to the sentiments of the grassroots of the community more.
That this is actually a very, very important point. This fear mongering factor I always speak to the fact that fear paralyzes, and if you want to ever usher change, you have to operate outside the sphere of fear within politics. I think one of the stories I'm actually reminded about from the Quran is the story of Musa alayhi salam and Bani Israel when they are taken out of Egypt, and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala issues them the command of taking Quds, and the response was, "You and your Lord go fight." So there's this idea of trauma, right? That having lived under tyranny and under oppression and surveillance for so long paralyzes you from action. But then the generation following that was able to undertake that mission. Now that may not necessarily be the same case here, but I think it's there's definitely a detach within how young Muslims voted and how some of the older generations voted, as you
Correct.
said. And the young Muslims tended to vote, more so away from this fear-mongering rhetoric
Correct.
in general. Whether that was, I believe majority of it was third party, but quite a few young Muslims actually did opt to vote for Donald Trump as well, based off of some preliminary data and also anecdotal conversations with young Muslim community members.
Yeah.
So how do we react from here, right? We're in no man's land at this point. We have detached ourselves from who we thought were our political patrons for so long.
Yeah.
And I've also heard the rhetoric within some establishment circles claiming that we are politically orphaned at this point. What do we make of that?
Number one, I think it's a misunderstanding to think that people on the left were actually our allies to begin with. And we see a lot of blaming that's going on right now, and even from some people, some Islamophobic rhetoric, because they felt like Muslims betrayed, we betrayed our daddy, so to speak, right? Which is the people on the left. I think that many people are starting to wake up and smell the coffee about that reality. So number one, we should have never seen them as our awliya to begin with, or actually our patron protectors. And this whole thing about orphans, I think it's a time for us to reclaim our izzah, reclaim our honor and our dignity. It's never for the believers that they should voluntarily have other people do for us what we should do for ourselves. Yes, we can work in coalition with people, but to expect people who themselves have their own implicit bias and racism, their own, I call it imanophobia. You may see some Islamophobia on the right, which is more racism. The left has imanophobia, right? Like they are against our traditional faith values and our ethics and traditional Islamic morality. They are, right? And this is why for funding for a lot of organizations, they have the litmus test that if Muslim organizations say anything in regards to gender or sexuality that's against their agenda, then they won't get funded, right? So this is a time for us to reevaluate, to get free. And I coined a saying a few years ago. I've talked with you about it, and I've said it a few times publicly, but who funds you runs you. And I suggest in our community, as we move forward, we do investigation about organizations who are speaking on our behalf. Who is actually funding them? Where's the money coming from? The Prophet ﷺ said, El yadu ula khayrun min al sufla. The hand that's like this that gives is better than the hand that's like this that's out begging, right? And if we have organizations, people who are in political organizing, and they're getting all of their money or a large portion of their money by people who aren't Muslims, then those people are being moved like pawns in a chess game, right? To unduly influence our community in certain ways that are going to be outside of our interests because they're not Muslims. They don't believe in Islam. They don't believe in our moral code. They don't believe in a lot of our long-term goals as people of Islam, Iman, wa Ihsan, right? And so we need to be honest about that, right? And all money is not good money. And I'm not saying that organizations can't take a little bit of money, but it should be strategic with the understanding that that money could be cut off at any moment for taking a position that is against those in status quo. But I would strongly, I mean, look, abandon Harris. There was a a movement that was funded by super PAC money outside of our community to intentionally try to undermine abandon Biden, which then became abandon Harris. It's been written about. It's no secret, right?
Right.
That money was gotten from the Democratic, a super PAC affiliate with the Democratic Party that tries to socially engineer the community. But alhamdulillah, as we've seen, like with the election, people are moving away from celebrity culture, and people are moving away from people who don't have grassroots credibility in the masajid and get money that is like parachuted into our community to try to influence us. Alhamdulillah, we are maturing as a Muslim community, and this is why I can say that at CARE Michigan, we don't take a single dime from this outside money, and this is how we're able to keep our integrity in advocating for positions in our community and for our religious rights, because we're not beholden to anyone. Again, who funds you runs you, and this is why I support the efforts of the like of Amin and what you're doing, because you are seeking your support from the grassroots of the Musallin, the brothers and sisters who are praying in masajid and involved in the Islamic work, instead of going out here begging elephants and begging donkeys for money. It's beneath our dignity as a community to be out there doing these things.
So I think there's a lot that has come to light, and I considered this electoral cycle kind of like a political crash course for our community.
Yeah.
One of the main things that came to light, which you just touched on, is the way that the nonprofit industrial complex,
Yeah.
which is something that we've talked about before privately, has sort of been managing the Muslim space so far.
Yeah.
Muslims have woken up to that partially from what happened with some of these organizations that we've just mentioned, being funded by outside sources who are inserting certain agendas into the Muslim political and Muslim political space and Muslim community as well. That's one of the things that we have matured about as a community. We're not necessarily there yet. I think we still have a long ways to go.
Yes, we do.
But a lot of people are way more willing to independently fund some of these causes now instead of relying on outside sourcing. And they're also becoming much more cautious about this outside sourcing and what their agenda is. I think what we've seen is that the so-called allies that we've had so far were not necessarily allies as much as they were opportunists.
Yeah.
Who were, using our community to further some of their personal social engineering agendas. I want to ask you something with regard, we spoke briefly about the no man's land that we find ourselves in. Obviously, genocide being, the number one issue that Muslims are still focused on and still concerned about, because it hasn't ended and we are still concentrating efforts behind this. But what should be, in your opinion, some of the top political priorities that we as an American Muslim community should rally behind and should look to rectify together?
Okay, so this is my independent view, and this does not represent CARE Michigan, just to be clear. But if we look at the maqasid al-sharia, the objectives of sacred law, domestically, it would be hizb din, the protection of religion, the protection of not only our practice, our practice of Islam, but this also includes the freedom of conscience, that we aren't compelled to affirm things that go against our sacred principles, or that our children are indoctrinated against our sacred principles, or something that can take them to kufr, to disbelief. Hizb din. Hizb din is the first principle for us domestically. And we can't help anyone else abroad if we can't help ourselves. Mm-hmm. So Hizb din is the first principle domestically. Hizb nafs is our first principle for foreign policy, right? So what I would say is that we need to have
can you
so Hizb nafs is the protection of life.
Mm-hmm.
This is our number one maqsad in regards to overseas. Mm-hmm. Domestically, it's Hizb din, it's the protection of our deen, the ability to practice it, and to have freedom of conscience and freedom of belief without it being infringed upon. Going back to the domestic, the last Pew Research study that came out about 3 or 4 years ago. I think it's even higher than that now if it were to be redone. Says that 1 out of every 4 Muslims who is born and raised in America, by the time they turn adult, they become a murtad or murtada, meaning they apostate from Islam. That doesn't even include some people who say they're ethnic Muslims or cultural Muslims who identify as Muslims but would hold beliefs of kufr. I would say probably 1 out of every 3 Muslims that's born in America and raised in America leaves Islam. This is a crisis. So to be able to protect our religious liberties, right? I think should be probably the number one priority. And any sort of law that has implications about this. This includes the gender and sexual confusion things about what's being taught in our schools, they're trying to even go down to elementary schools, middle schools, high schools, the whole issues of locker rooms, the capacity or the ability, even in some areas, we're still zoning challenges in regards to blocking masajid in Islamic schools, the issues of where traditional Muslim teachers are somehow even or professors getting banned or barred from getting tenure at universities because maybe they're too Islamic. I think this is a big deal domestically. This needs to be a political focus. Overseas, of course, there's genocide, but it is American policy that seeks to not only kill Muslims, but neo-colonial agendas that would seek to take Muslims away from their deen overseas too. So sometimes these go hand in hand. And I'll give you an example. So we have the military-industrial complex that goes and bombs countries. So let me use Yemen as an example, because many people forget that prior to the killing and the mass famine in Sudan, Yemen was considered the greatest humanitarian crisis zone in the world. Yemen, right? What was going on in Yemen? American bombs with American satellite technologies being used to devastate Yemen, bomb Yemen to bits. Not only that, blockades for food and medical supplies, cholera outbreaks. Now, when I was in Egypt last year, and I met with some scholars from the south of Yemen, and we were discussing about what's going on. After they kill all these Muslims, Western aid organizations were going into Hadramaut, but to check out what they're doing. They were saying, oh, we only want women to come to get the aid. And then they offer them literacy programs in which they teach them radical feminism to then try to take them away from Islam, right? So you bomb a country, then you claim that after you bomb it, you starve them, and then you seek to so-called liberate them and give them aid and to liberate the women, to then try to take people into kufr. This is something that we need to be very concerned about, and why I believe the anti-war movement, mashallah, the anti-war spirit is being revived in America, right?
And it's not just the Muslim.
And not just the Muslims. And I think that when it comes to our foreign policy, we need to give further breadth and support the anti-war movement as part of our political priority and be against those who are warmongers and align with the military-industrial complex.
I think, this is a critical point, and I wanna focus on it a little longer, because one of the things that really resonated right now is when you said that we cannot help our brothers and sisters overseas unless we are rectified by ourselves, right? For the past 2 decades, I think we have neglected our spiritual priorities as a community while focusing so heavily, and not everyone, but those managers who've been in charge of our political operations so far. And I call them managers, by the way, because they are not working on behalf of the Muslim community with institutions. They're working on behalf of institutions with the Muslim community. So those managers have been so focused and so worried on political maneuvering for what truthfully have been marginal and optical gains, that they have neglected the spiritual well-being of our community. And they have given access to radical anti-Islamic agendas to penetrate within our communities.
Yeah.
This is a problem. And we've seen it reflect in our youth, in our spaces, in our households even. We see this reflected. Do you think there is an opportunity, because of the diverse political spectrum that we now have as Muslims, to refocus on this issue? To refocus on cultivating what you called as Hizbul Deen
Hezbollah, Naam.
in the United States. So this domestic priority of protecting your Islamic well-being, your spiritual well-being as a Muslim, your freedom to live and practice without any ideological burden from outside.
I think it is, and I think that we need to have these discussions openly with the community and have them in our masajid. Look, the reality is, with all the fear-mongering, we're not facing an age of Muslims being mass rounded up like Japanese internment camps. We're not facing anything close to like what my parents' generation faced in America with Jim Crow. Like, we're not facing anything that Malcolm X faced or Muhammad Ali. You know, like, even after 9/11, American Muslims didn't even face a quarter of what African Americans faced, like during the civil rights movement prior in Jim Crow, right? So we have the ability, even in America, as of now, and I always say that if we don't use our rights, we will lose our rights. We have the ability in America to freely preach Islam, to organize Islamic institutions, and to begin to give tarbiyah and train up our youth towards an Islamic worldview, more so than in many Muslim majority countries. I can tell you that some of the khutbah that I gave on Fridays and criticized the political establishment, if I were in much of the Muslim world, especially the Arab world, if I would be allowed to be on the minbar, I would be arrested before Maghrib prayer. Here, I could get up and say Genocide Joe, Killer Kamala, right? And I'm sitting here right now, right? So we have an opportunity to refocus. And I think with the level of apostasy in our community, we have the religious right, as well as we should have the political focus to really drill down on this issue, the protection of our religious liberties, and discussing these things with politicians. And believe me, especially when we're talking about people on the right and maybe some on the left may begin to reevaluate their political strategy and going too far to the left on some of these social issues. But I tell you, and I've spoken with people involved in the Catholic community. We've spoken with people who are Mormons. They either are in the Republican Party or they are adjacent. They're not like registered Republicans. There is some space that we can make for ourselves in preserving our religious liberties, that we can pass on this this Islamic heritage and this spiritual lineage to our offspring and to our grandchildren who have been born and great-grandchildren, if we make this a priority and start to talk with people on the right who have a like mind and are worried about the erosion of respect for religion and the sacred in these United States of America.
So last question,
Yeah.
and I think it's going to be a bit of a blunt one too. The Democratic Party has kind of used, I would say, predatory practices and this is common within their politics, not just within the Muslim community, but broader minority groups as well, of victimizing communities and giving them the victim mindset,
Yeah.
so that they can then essentially take them under their wing and not allow them to dictate their own priorities. Is the era of Muslim victim politics done?
I would hope that it's done, but I don't think that it's going to be done. And like, we didn't get here overnight, and we're not going to get out of it overnight. I think that for many of our youth, and I look at what's going on, I see some promise that we're starting to break out of the victimhood mentality, but it's not totally gone. And once Donald Trump gets into office, and the first policy that he does, that people who want to promote this victim mentality, they're going to go and say, see what happened. We need to get back underneath the umbrella of these people. It's so predictable that I hear some of the conversations taking
They're
place
already
already.
happening.
They're
Yeah.
already happening. But for those who read the Quran and contemplate, Allah Tabaraka wa Ta'ala says, and izzah and dignity belongs to Allah, and then through the messenger and to the believers. This is what Allah says. And this is where dignity and honor is not being affiliated with any one political party or expecting those people to be our first line of protection. As a matter of fact, if people believe that other people or a group is their primary source of protection, this is faulty aqidah. This is a faulty belief, because at the end of the day, it is only Allah Tabaraka wa Ta'ala who protects. He may use certain people as what's called asbab, as means, but no one gets any protection without the protection of Allah Tabaraka wa Ta'ala. And there's no tawfiq, there is no success long term in the dunya or in the akhirah by disobeying the Quran, disobeying Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam, and this includes having unconditional allegiance or wala for people who disbelieve in Islam. And we always have to remember this. The Quran is the framework and is the path towards success in all matters, including politically, socially and politically. And we should not fall for those who would say, oh, just relieve Deen or Islam for the masajid. The imams don't need to be involved, and then just leave it all to the political organizers and to the more secular-minded people, as if trying to make a distinction between the religious and the secular, right? That is failing some people in the Christian community, and we don't want to follow them down the religious hole.
Well, Imam Dawood, Jazakumullah khair. Thank you for the
Wa yakum.
insightful conversation and opinions. And to our respected brothers and sisters who are with us right now live and who may view this later, Jazakumullah khair for tuning in to this week's episode with Imam Dawood Walid on the American Muslim political impact in these elections and the opportunity that the American Muslim community has been given to reshape its political path in this country, possibly the path of our brothers and sisters overseas, by reclaiming its agency and exercising it with izzah, with honor and with dignity and with allegiance to our values, to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and to our ummah first and foremost. Jazakumullah.